Hi everyone, this is our Biology 105 Human Impacts lecture where we'll be taking what we've learned in our preceding section on general biology and how ecosystems function, and we'll be applying that to how humans impact those systems and then what the consequences are for us. And today we're just going to briefly begin with an introduction to human impacts and the root causes for human impacts. Okay, so let's start off with that component I just mentioned. How have humans impacted environmental resources, which of course we've referred to as natural capital in the past? So let's look at that. If you have a look at this figure here, it's showing the percentage of land in different areas around the planet that is devoted to supporting humans. And you can see that in those areas which have been agricultural heartlands, we have obvious high percentage devoted to humans. Having a look at the dark green areas, what do you notice about the patterns? They are associated with boreal forests, desert, and to some extent tropical forests. And that's important because if we then think about some of our questions about how we use land, a lot of it's for urbanization, but much of it is for agriculture. And we're basically using all the high productivity land with a few exceptions. We do mining, that's another factor, but it's less of a consideration than the loss for agriculture. Solar farms could be one way in which in the future we might start to use things like deserts, for example. Maybe we'll increase our proportion in those regions. We might even start to work our way into the boreal forests up in Russia and Canada, especially if climate change enables us to have longer growing seasons and hotter temperatures further north. So, interesting patterns. And if you think about what you just saw, what percentage of the world's land area do you think is devoted to urban or agricultural use? Well, the answer is it's about 40%, which is a staggeringly high number if you think about it. But if you actually exclude the tundra, the desert, hot deserts, and the tropical forest there, pardon me, just exclude the tundra and the desert, you actually end up with about 70% of the world's surface is devoted to supporting humanity, which is even more staggering concept to think about. It makes you realize how dominant we are and makes us wonder what has caused us to require so much resources. We'll come on to that a little bit later. So if you can break it down, it looks a little bit like this. And there you can see there's that tundra and desert segment in the darker greener colors, which are effectively unproductive for agriculture. Okay, what about water use? Well, unsurprisingly, we have dramatically increased our freshwater use over the last 50 to 100 years to the point where we're now exceeding the capacity of the groundwater stores we have, especially in those agricultural regions in India, in also the Middle East, and in California and Mexico as well, as well as China. These areas have grossly overused groundwater supplies, which will run out if we persist using them as much as we are. Coupled to that, we are using tons of fertilizer, and that is a correlate of ground irrigation as well. So here's where we're using all that water for agriculture too. It's a big factor here in our use. Okay, so that's a bit of a word for warning. What percentage of fisheries in the marine environment do we think are overexploited? So I showed you some of the freshwater stats there. Let's just think about things like herring or salmon or prawns. What do you reckon as a proportion of these are being used beyond the capacity at which they can be used sustainably? Well, the answer is 70%. And that's driven by increasing efficacy of our catch techniques. So we've just become so good at catching these organisms with these factory ships and fleets of surrounding boats that are able to go and target huge shoals with very large nets that we can effectively over consume fish from the environment. So it's not the fruit of the sea, infinite. It's in fact a constrained resource which we are overexploiting. And this little figure here shows you back in the 1950s, over 85% were underexploited. But as we move forward to the 1990s and the 2000s, we started to see that many stocks had crashed from overfishing and others were overexploited, with the remainders all fully exploited. Basically nowhere where we're underexploiting anymore. Okay, how about the air? What have we put up there? Well, actually, there's some positive stories on that front because we've cleaned up our industry to an extent with devices called scrubbers fitted into the chimneys, which reduce the amount of gases, toxic gases that we put up there. But there's a lot of other stuff that we've been putting into the atmosphere. So over here is air pollution, predominantly from things like heavy metals from industry and other gases, with a obvious concentration in our areas of primary manufacturing globally. And so that's where we're seeing big issues for air quality. Um, we also had problems in the past, things like CFCs from refrigerants. These weren't recycled; they were just released into the atmosphere when fridges broke or were disposed of, and the CFCs broke down the ozone layer and caused high levels of cancer in the North and South Pole. But this one's actually a success story because we did manage to control the use of CFCs in a global agreement, and so that has kind of led to a reduction in damage caused by CFCs. We do, however, still see acid rain, which is basically where factory chemicals react with water vapor to create acid, which then can fall as rain and kill forests and lakes. In Canada, we have big problems with this around Ontario in particular. Again, solved to an extent by those scrubbers I mentioned earlier. But the big one for air these days is really global warming and greenhouse gases that we release through fossil fuel burning, primarily, and particularly carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide lasts a long time in the atmosphere, and it is a greenhouse gas, and we've massively increased the concentrations in our atmosphere. Bear in mind, this graph is a little bit disingenuous because it starts at the zero axis over the 0 point here in 1750, starts at 270, not at zero. Nevertheless, we have seen an uptick in carbon dioxide in recent years, and that has continued to the present point. What's the consequence? Well, we all know about global warming, and so this is a temperature chart, global temperature chart, going from the year 300 right through to the present. What we use is thermometer-based records in more recent years, and then going back into the past, we're using proxy records, which basically ice, bubbles in ice, tree rings, coral growth, all of these things which we can look at. And these proxy-based records also show a sudden spike, incidentally, in the global temperatures. So it looks like we've been doing something since the mid to late 1800s involving greenhouse gases potentially, which has caused this big spike in temperatures. And that obviously is what we know as human-caused climate change. This is a little map of the risks that we've incurred from that, and risk density is in the darker areas. And so primarily we're talking here about flooding or desertification, which can damage communities. Okay. The reason why it's worse in some areas than others is because of population density as well and ability to respond. So countries which are not as wealthy with larger populations are going to be more exposed. Bangladesh obviously is very dark in this because it has a huge population. It's very low lying with exposure to flooding, as an example. Finally, what about for life? What have we done to that with our human impacts? Well, we've had a bit of an uptick in extinctions. And moreover, a bigger problem is just the general decline in population sizes of all of our species. The actual extinctions themselves have largely been driven by habitat loss. For example, palm plantations in Indonesia, persecution and harvesting, over-harvesting. That's what did for the Steller sea cow up in the Bering Sea north of us here. Or it's just invasive species. So rats on islands have caused an enormous number of extinctions because these island-dwelling species are not adapted to a mammal like a rat, which would otherwise have not been able to get to the island without us moving them there. So really, to summarize, we've seen these increasing resource uses by humans and concomitant impacts on natural systems. And the end point of this is that we effectively run out of resources. And here's our reindeer. You may recall I gave an example of how they were introduced to an island. They boomed in population. They ate all the grass, and then there was no more grass, and the population crashed. In theory, we could do that to our planet because of the extent to which we are overusing resources. And so that's scary. You know, we as humans have done this before. For example, on Easter Island, which was a treed island. We chopped down all the trees, used up all the resources, and then the population crashed. Similarly, we saw that with other founder populations in small, closed environments. So huge is our population now that we're effectively on a small, closed environment, which is planet Earth. So I worry about our ability to shift to sustainably using our resources and maybe even recovering a bit of our natural capital. So in our next section, we're going to dive into what the causes of human impacts really are. So how can we quantify how much impact we're having? Well, we then can think, are we actually exceeding our carrying capacity? So is this premise of mine true that we are overusing our resources? And then we can think about, if we are, how can we actually reduce human impacts in the future and live more sustainably? And so over the next sequence of lectures, we're going to break this down, and we're going to do kind of like a mini breakdown in this lecture of some of the primary causes. Let's roll with that then. So we're going to deal with what's called the IPAT model of human impact, which is causal explanation. So the I is going to stand for the total impact that we have, and it's going to be equal to the population size multiplied by how much we consume, which is the correlate of affluence. And finally, you're multiplying that by technology, because technology can both increase or decrease that impact that we are having. So bear in mind, these are not the root causes, but they would correctly describe how much impact is having in a given area. Population times consumption multiplied by technology gives you roughly how much impact you're having. What's the root cause, though? Have a think about that. Well, the answer is it's kind of to do with our desire for stuff, and our desire to have more people potentially. And so those are separate, and we will come to them at some point in this lecture, particularly for population. But that desire for stuff comes down to potentially quality of life, or potentially materialism as a cultural goal. And so you don't have to have materialism for high quality of life. But for many, materialism is associated with quality of life. And that is one of our very sticky points in our society. Okay, so we'll deal with population. That's our primary component that we're going to talk about today. So global populations have spiked rather dramatically, growing from around 1750 and accelerating in the middle of the 1900s, with enormous population growth globally. I like to sort of think about how my gran was born in an era where there's like 1.5 billion people on Earth, and now there's 8 billion people. I mean, the world in which my grandparents grew up was so fundamentally different from the one I grew up in myself that their conception of how much impact humans can have on the world is also very, very different. Many people, of course, do see that and have seen that change in their lifespan and what they call a shifting baseline in terms of the expectation of what our planet's like. If you're growing up in the early 1900s, the world was probably an enormously different place in terms of human impacts. Okay, so why did that happen anyway? Well, next A is going to be consumption. Huge economic growth, and that's been led by rich countries using more resources. So if you look at this little graph here, it's the amount of income, and you can see that incomes in Africa have been growing, particularly recently, although they've stagnated. Income in East and South Asia have massively increased, and if you followed this for another 20 years, I should get a new graph here, it's going to be a rapid growth. So it'd be interesting to see where that growth point has reached at this point. And of course, back when a couple of regions did grow a little bit more quickly, we had these OECD nations, so high development index nations, which had earlier grown, starting from the early 1800s. Basically, we're using more resources because we have greater wealth. Here's another little chart showing that consumption increase since 1970, and correlating with that, we have the amount of CO2 we're producing, and this purple line is the global manufacturing index, so the amount of stuff we're making. So yeah, we have been making more things and using more resources associated with our economic development. Okay, so look at these charts. If you're getting confused by what they're showing, the idea is you go, bottom here is the year. On the side, we have this scale. It's actually not axis labeled, which is poor, but of consumption, as it were. And then this is a graph showing these relative levels of manufacturing. You can see that that's going to go from low to high, and likewise for GDP and CO2. There's a lot wrong with this graph, actually. First of all, it doesn't start from zero on the y-axis, always a bit misleading. Second, it's not labeled with time, and we don't know what their arbitrary units are on the left, but it would surely be different from each of these three things. So it's kind of ironic I picked on this graph as one to show you because it's rather poor. Okay, let's get to technology. How has that changed? Well, have a little look at this chart here, and I want you to think about the total world population, which is this dark, thick black line, and how that's changed since 1900. And then have a little look at the world population without Haber-Bosch, which is the sort of reddish line, and then the world population fed by Haber-Bosch, which is this dotted line. And so total population is a combination of these two. What pattern do we see? Well, we can clearly kind of make out that the more recent population growth is primarily driven by the availability of nitrates generated by the Haber-Bosch process, which has led to an increase in fertilizer use and in productivity, including of meat, because they need grasslands, which we generate with nitrogen, i.e. alfalfa. So this is really illustrating that technology in the form of the Haber-Bosch process kind of supercharged our population growth by making more food available. And it's believed we don't have capacity to make the volume of food required to feed planet Earth without Haber-Bosch process. Okay, so that's how technology can impact. Maybe think about how technology has had positive and negative impacts. And I want you to think about this for the environment. And that's important because if we said for people, we could say it's been great because it's led to tons of people having food security. So we love the Haber-Bosch process, right? But what about for the environment? Like what's a good thing or a bad thing about a technology like Haber-Bosch process? Have a think about that. I'm not sure if I can even pause this. Yeah, no, I don't think I can, which is a frustrating aspect of my current video editor. What I would say is, for positive, the environmental impacts are hard to see. Negative's obvious. We got more people, they use more stuff, they take up more space. Okay. Positive could be that by having better availability of fertilizers, we could actually have higher productivity from the same area of land. And that means we don't need to expand our agriculture to take on more and more land, right? We can just increase productivity from the available and existing land. So in a sense, you could argue that the Haber-Bosch process could be used to reduce habitat loss. That's an example. Okay. So let's think about those technology impacts, increased or decreased. You think about things like fire, agriculture, money, which facilitated increased trade, ships, also more transport and trade, or material goods. These are all ways in which we've increased impact because we've been generating greater resource use. You can decrease impacts, though, with things like pollution control, like a sewage plant, or by switching to renewable energy, or using harvesting technologies, for example, like GM, genetic modification, to increase crop yields, or birth control. Down the bottom here, I've got a cool thing. This is actually a turtle filter. So turtles often get caught in trawling nets. So this is being pulled behind a boat. You have to imagine a boat in the middle of the screen. And then this is actually going to be getting pulled along behind. And if a turtle goes in, it gets shunted out the bottom of the net. But if it's a fish, it goes through this grid and gets caught in the net at the back. That's the rationale here. Small fish can escape. Big fish of the correct size remain. So, yeah, it's a little bit of technology to avoid fishing bycatch and killing turtles. Right. So you get things that give us positive and negative impacts very